right, welcome everybody. We have several new people today, so I'm going to start from the very beginning. And my name is Irene Pasternak. I'm a Feldenkrais practitioner in Bellevue, Washington. And Mira and Jordan from Northwest Parkinson's are here in the meeting. They are the organizers and sponsors of this meeting. So if you like it, tell them, because we're looking at continuing this after the month because we're getting such great participation from it. But let them know if you like it, because that helps them decide what to do in their programming. For everybody, and especially for those who it's your first time in a Feldenkrais class, there's only one ground rule, which is nothing we do should hurt. So if I ask you to do a movement and it doesn't feel good in your body, I want you to do it smaller, gentler, just in your imagination. Feel free to ask questions in the chat. Mira and Jordan monitor the chat and they'll bring up the question to the group if you have a question. And that the purpose of this class is learning how to find pleasure in your body. And we're looking at practicing doing things the easy, pleasurable way, because our brains, the human brain, when it finds something easy and pleasurable, it wants more. And we want to make it so that your daily movements of standing up, sitting down, walking, turning, reaching for something, give you pleasure, so that unloading the dishwasher can be like dancing. That's what we're after. And we've been working toward easier walking for the last few weeks. And today we're going to put some of those pieces together. But don't worry if you're here for the first time, there's plenty to learn. I will be asking you many questions, and you don't need to answer them out loud, but when you answer them to yourself, I visualize it as you're widening the bandwidth, like there's a pipe between your brain and your muscles. And every time you ask a question and try to sense something, you're expanding that communication channel. And Parkinson's has this way of narrowing the channel so it gets harder to communicate with yourself, and we're just gently widening the channel so that communication is easier. So we start every class with a measurement move of something to notice, and then we'll notice what the change is at the end. So for this measurement move, I'd like you to close your eyes and to sense a line that goes between one shoulder and the other. And in your mind's eye, with your eyes closed, look at one side of the line and look at the other side and go back and forth like your eyes are looking from one shoulder to the other shoulder. And get a sense of how long that line is. And then begin to make a line from one hip joint to the other hip joint. And if you're not sure exactly where your hip joints are, where your thigh bone connects to your pelvis, let's everybody take your right knee and move it in and out a few times. So left and right. So it goes towards your other knee and away from your other knee. And see if you can track the sensation to the top place that you feel movement when you take your knee left and right. It's usually somewhere on the crease line when you bend your leg, and about halfway between the back surface of your body and the front surface of your body is where the ball and socket of your hip is. And then with your left leg, do the same thing. Take your knee left and right and trace that sensation to where the top of that sensation is.
Are you seated as you do this?
Say it again, please.
Are you seated as you do this?
Yes, seated. Mm-hmm. So when you move your knee back and forth, see if you can sense that place where your thigh bone comes into your pelvis. That's your hip joint. And make a line between your two hip joints in your mind. And then I think we might use a different line for a moment. Put your hands right at the top of your pelvis, right? You'll feel a bone on the sides, and you can do this in sitting, but I'm just standing up so that you can see where the hands are. And draw that imaginary line between those two hands. And then notice the relationship between the two lines, the line between your shoulders and the line between the top of your pelvis from one side to the other. And notice, are they perfectly parallel to each other, or are they tipped a little? And they might be tipped. I'm going to share my screen for a moment and put a picture to look at. So you'll see it's a picture of an animated figure and walking, and there's a green line and a purple line. And as you can see in those pictures, the lines are not perfectly parallel on them. And you probably, when you sense yourself, they're not perfectly parallel. And it may be that one line is like your shoulder line. One shoulder is in front of the other shoulder a little bit, or one hip might be a little forward of the other one. And then imagine the line like the red line in the picture that connects the middle of the top line and the middle of the bottom line. And feel, does that line point to the ceiling as you're sitting? Or does it point a little forward or a little backward? A little left or a little right? Okay, we're going to play with those lines over the course of the lesson. And for those of you who are comfortable standing up and walking for a moment, go ahead and stand up. Put your hands on your hips again, on the top of your pelvis. And go for a little walk and feel, what movement do you feel in your pelvis as you walk? You might feel a little rotation of your pelvis, or a little up down under your hands, or a little angle in your hands, or you might feel that your hips stay fairly level when you walk. We're all pretty unique in how we do this with how we walk with our hips. It's why when you see somebody at night and you can only see their silhouette, you know who you're seeing by their pattern of movement. Okay. Once you get a sense of what your hips are doing right now, come and sit down again. Okay. So remember, when we do the movements in the class, to do them small, gentle, and that it isn't so much that you do the movement as that you sense the connections that happen in you during the movement. And I'm going to have you, when I say do a movement, I want you to do it and undo it, do it and undo it many times. So it's very different than yoga, where you go to the end of the movement and hold it. Here we just play in the realm of easy, going back and forth. So try pressing one of your sit bones down into your chair. See if you can put more pressure on one sit bone than the other. And begin to notice if something happens to the other sit bone when you press one sit bone harder into your chair. Does the other one lighten on your chair a little bit? And when you put the pressure on that sit bone, do you feel taller or shorter on that side of your body? Is there some way that your ribs participate that make it easier to put some pressure on that sit bone? What happens under your feet? And do you feel a little subtle shift in your eyeballs? Like you're looking somewhere a little different, or your eyes move when you push down on the sit bone? Okay, good. Rest for a sec. The rests are to give your brain a break from thinking and noticing. And now begin to press on the other sit bone. It's an interesting thing of how do you organize to put pressure on one side So notice what your feet do to help you. When you put pressure on this sit bone, does the other one lift a little off the chair? Do your ribs move in some way? Good. Rest for a moment. Now, I want you, okay, we're going to go back to the first side. So whichever side you chose first, put your weight on that sit bone. Uh-oh. Sorry, can't figure out how to make it stop, but it'll stop in a moment. And when you put your weight on that sit bone, what happens to the shoulder on the same side? Does it go up or does it go down? See if you can find a way to put the weight on the sit bone that your shoulder either lifts up or your shoulder goes down. Okay. And then try it on the other side. You put the weight on one sit bone and then the shoulder either goes up or the shoulder goes down. And rest for a moment. So now we're going to try doing this movement in a different way, which is instead of thinking about pushing down on one sit bone, think about lifting one sit bone off the chair. This is a lot like what we did on Tuesday when we were getting up onto the book. You lift one sit bone off your chair. Okay. And I'm going to stand for a sec. I want you to imagine that there's a stick that goes between the sit bone that you're lifting and your opposite shoulder. So that when you lift the sit bone, that stick pushes up through you and lifts your opposite shoulder. See if you can find that little motion. Sometimes when we lift, it's as if the stick was aimed at our waist. But I want you to really control the angle of the stick so that it lifts the shoulder. I'm going to look on the second page. Good. Now, change that in your mind that instead of the stick, that what you have is a string, and try lifting your shoulder, and that string is tied to your opposite sit bone and hip, and you lift your shoulder and it pulls that sit bone up a little bit. And is it easier for you to imagine the stick or the string? And the string has a little stretch to it, so you start the movement and then you can feel somehow the elastic inside you tightens and it lifts the hip. you could take your hand and put it on your hip right at the top of your pelvis where we've been doing when we were talking about that before. And you can feel how you can use your hand to help your hip lift a little. Or you could put your hand under your sit bone, lift the sit bone, and aim at the shoulder. Okay, good. And rest for a moment. And see if you're already sitting a little differently than you did at the beginning. If you feel a little taller, perhaps, a little more upright. And let's play with the other side. So on the other side, you're going to lift your sit bone and imagine a stick that comes right up kind of under your shoulder, right where the ball and socket is, and lifts your shoulder up. And notice what happens in your ribs as you aim this force right up into the shoulder. And notice if your habit is to aim the force a little lower, and you can play with how high you aim your stick for how you lift your shoulder. Usually problems in our shoulders happen if our opposite hip isn't lifting the shoulder like that, okay? And then switch it to the string. So you're imagining a string to your hip joint or to your sit bone and to your shoulder, and you lift the shoulder and it pulls you up, pulls that opposite side up. We're trying to get the middle of us more connected. You'll feel how the ribs have to expand a little on one side and contract on the other. You can use your hand, put it under your sit bone, and lift the sit bone to lift the shoulder. Yeah. Or you could put your hand on the top of your hip and encourage your hip, your pelvis to tilt. So if this cell phone is your pelvis, by lifting this corner, you lift the opposite side. That's the movement that we're doing. Good. Okay, and rest for a moment. And just close your eyes for a moment. And after doing this little bit of play, notice, redraw the line from shoulder to shoulder and hip to hip. And see if they have gotten a little bit more symmetric than they were at the beginning. We're just reminding our brain of this connection, and then the brain resettles us into usually a little bit more symmetric position. Okay. Now, in the first class, we played with sliding our sit bones, one forward, one backward. And I want you to wake up that movement in your body. And I find it helps to actually put my fists out like I'm going to punch somebody. And as I punch with my right hand, I slide my right sit bone forward. And you know how when you punch, you pull an arm back? So pull one arm back as you punch and let that sit bone go backward. And then punch with the other hand and let the sit bone go backward. So it's like slow motion boxing where you're punch, punch, and then do it a little faster where you're punching, and your bottom is sliding on your chair, which for some chairs, like the one I'm sitting on today, there's a little too much friction to go fast. Go at whatever speed feels okay for your chair. And feel how your sternum, this bone, turns one way and turns the other way as you punch. You know, when you're punching, you never want to be punching like this, because then somebody can punch anywhere in your chest. But if you turn sideways, then you present less surface area to be punched. Good. Okay, rest for a moment. Did anybody notice what their belly button was doing while they were punching? We're not really used to scanning and going, what's my belly button doing? Go ahead and punch again like that. And this time, notice what your belly button is doing. It kind of points one way and it points the other way. And your whole rib cage, you can see it on my shirt, you can feel it in yourself. Your rib cage is turning from side to side. Good. Okay. So now we're going to combine the two movements that we've worked on, the lifting a hip to lift the opposite shoulder, lifting a sit bone to lift the opposite shoulder. And let's everybody lift your right sit bone, which lifts your left shoulder, and it takes your right sit bone so that it's a little off your chair. And then slide that sit bone backwards and put it down. And then lift your left sit bone, which lifts your right shoulder, and slide it backwards and put it down. And walk as far back as you can walk into your chair. And you'll end up against the back of it. And then walk forward with that, lifting the sit bone, coming forward, putting it down, lifting the other one, putting it forward, and coming down. Okay. And then rest for a moment, and I want to show you a few videos of walking so that you can see this motion in the skeleton. So the first one I want to show you is a little animation, and in this animation, it's just from the waist down. And I want you, the ball that is the person's hips have two colors. I want you to watch the rotation and the movement of that ball in this animated walking. So let me share my screen. Okay. And let me make it go full screen. Notice how the red and the green lines rotate in this walk. Okay, now just have to leave full screen so I can show you the next one. This next one is a comparison of a skeleton of Lucy and a modern human. Just focus on the modern human. It had the nicest walking motion of any skeleton I could find. And you can see in this one, the pelvis is in orange, which makes it easy to follow the movements of it. You can see that there's a rotation side to side, and that one hip goes up a little and the other hip goes down a little. And you can see in the rib cage, there's just a little subtle moving the rib cage left and right. Okay. And then this last one is an amputee showing how he's giving exercises for your core. But when you see it without legs, you can really see the movement that we were just doing. So he lifts his hip and comes forward. You can see how he uses his shoulders to go opposite. When the hip comes, that he's twisting in the shoulders and side bending in the ribs a little bit. So after seeing that and seeing those examples, I want you to try again the walking in your chair. And you can see, are you getting all the components of it? Are your hips going up and down? Are your hips going a little bit forward and back? Is there a moment in this walking where you feel, everybody stop for a moment, and when you lift a hip and think about going backward, you have to pull your belly in a little bit to go backwards. So when you lift, go ahead and lift one side, pull your belly in as your sit bone goes backward. And then to go forward, you lift, and there's a way your belly almost pushes forward and it helps push the hip forward. And the weird thing with that one, when we're walking, our pelvis is actually doing a little bit of this kind of motion. And one side of the belly pulls in while one pushes out. And that's what gets the smooth motion in walking. Go ahead and stand up again. And put your hands on your hips again and walk a little bit. And see now if you're feeling some movement in, a little more movement in your hips that looks like those pictures that we were seeing. And then let your hands hang so that you can get your shoulders into your walk. And trace those lines between your two shoulders and your two hips as you're walking. So you have to kind of almost walk in slow motion. But those lines go, they tip and they twist a little as you're walking. I see some people doing the walk big. So really exaggerating your arm swing and your shoulder movement. So everybody stand still for a moment. And I dropped my camera behind my computer. There it comes back again. Keep your hips still and twist your shoulders. And notice what your arms do when you do that. How your arms swing, but they don't swing straight forward and back. How they kind of wrap around your body a little bit. Good. Okay. Now leave your shoulders still and turn your hips. Okay. Let's everybody turn your shoulders and your hips together. So your shoulders go to the right as your hips go to the right. And your shoulders go left as your hips go left. Okay. And then try and have them go opposite each other. So shoulders go left as the hips go right. And shoulders go right as the hips go left. And then give a try to marching in place where you tap your opposite knee. And as you lift your leg, feel your hip. It lifts up as you lift your leg. And that tapping gets you that cross-body motion. Okay. And then come have a seat. And I'd like to take a few minutes today to hear how it's going for you, of what you're noticing was different about your lines at the end of the lesson, or about your walking, your general sense of mobility, mood. So you could either raise your hand and Mira or Jordan and I will unmute you, or unmute yourself and just speak up.
I will say that is really feels befuddled. It's like my body doesn't get it. It feels very complicated, and when I'm walking, it's just
Okay.
yeah. And the rotations are not even, and they almost feel like, contorted.
It is a fairly complicated motion, human walking, and when you have a pattern in your body like the one that you have, this is going to take a little while because it requires relearning how to do some movements that your body hasn't been doing for a while. And so sometimes the cues that we talk about are the part that helps you put it together. Like you mentioned in another class, Cindy, that if you think about expanding, like leading with your ribs, that makes everything a little easier. So pick the conscious part of our brain can't keep up with, oh, my shoulders have to go one way, my hips go the other, but they can keep up with a cue. Like if I lead with my shoulder and I go up and then I go up.
The visualization of the skeleton helps, but I don't know which way hips move. Do they always go how do they pivot? Like what do hips do?
So the movements that the hips can do, one hip can go up, like if you're carrying a baby on your hip or your sack of groceries, and that movement is part of walking. Hips can turn sideways, and then hips can tip forward or tip backward.
Can one side be independent of the other? Is there anything in the middle?
Yes. In fact, to walk, there is an independence that one goes one way and the other goes the other way.
Okay, that's important.
It's weird because we're used to thinking about our bottom as this like big lump, right? And it's a big lump that doesn't move. We just sit on it. But it has to be able to go up and down and forward and backward and side to side in order for walking to be smooth. So we were talking last week about the pelvic movements are the things that really unlock the body.
I always thought that they were fused at the bottom, like a pelvis couldn't actually, it wasn't separated one side from the other.
There's cartilage in there, and in the back, the sacroiliac joints allow some movement, and in the front, the pubic bone comes together with some cartilage, and it doesn't need a lot of motion. So when I show this with my hands, it looks bigger than it is in real life, but it's just a little bit of motion there that allows that movement to happen.
Good, thank you.
I think Laura Gould, you had a question? Was it answered in this? You're muted, so you would have to.
I guess I'm just glad to hear Cindy say that, because this kind of kinesthetic learning, knowing where your body is in space, totally mystifying for me.
It is, yeah, I'm really glad both of you are sharing that. We're just, when a baby learns something, the baby learns, I want that toy, and then it just happens and they get it. And it's not a conscious learning. And that's good enough to get people by for most daily activities until one of several things happen. As we age, we lose muscular strength. And so if our movements were a little inefficient, they get harder to do. If we get Parkinson's disease, the communication to your muscles goes down. And so Feldenkrais is really useful. And the third is if you're an athlete or a musician or anybody who does repetitive work of any sort, where you have to get really good at doing that repetitive work in a way that doesn't hurt you. Those are the people who come and find that by practicing this kinesthetic awareness, they just get better and better at their movements. But you've been doing it now for 2.5 weeks. You're still baby beginners in learning how to sense yourself.
Oh no, this ain't my first rodeo.
And for some people, depending on learning styles, the kinesthetic is a stretch. But there's an incredible amount of joy to be found in playing with it for a while. So hang in there. And notice, you know, at the end of one of these classes, when you get up and move, do you feel a little bit more mobile, a little looser? And know that you don't have to understand any of it or be conscious of it, but just by the sequence of exercises tricks your body into more of that mobility.
I think Bill and Nina. Nina has a question. You have to unmute yourself, Nina.
I was just going to mention that I've taken Feldenkrais before and that this is incredibly helpful for other things like bad hips and everything. But one of the things that we do when we walk is that instead of trying to do all these things at one time, I'll say to Bill, sternum. And then we'll just think, where's our sternum going? You know, and then we'll say, is knee over toe? And so we're just doing like one thing at a time to focus on. And sometimes it'll take us 15 to 20 steps to be able to do something, because you're kind of adding like layers at a time rather than just starting and then starting to walk perfectly, doing all these things at one time. It's just too much to be thinking about every single thing at one time.
The wonderful thing about our brain, Nina, that's a wonderful description of it, is that when our brain senses options, it picks the better one. And so you're going, Bill, you've got an option for your sternum. It can move back and forth. And you play with that for a couple, 10 steps. And then, great, the brain's aware of that. And then, oh, there's an option for where you land on your foot. And you play with that for a while. And the brain picks, and it builds. I love hiking. And I often pick hikes that are too long for me. And the last mile or two is torture. And my knees hurt or my hips hurt, or, you know, I'm just desperate to be done. And I do exactly what you just said. I just think of one body part for a while and think of all the, like, what could I do with it? And then all of a sudden I'm at the end of the trail. And that's much better than trying to think of all of it at once, because all of it at once just blows our minds, because our conscious mind can't keep track of all these things. Any other tips people have found that they've used from class?
Anne would, but you have to unmute yourself, Anne.
Anne, you're unmuted.
Okay. I just agree with everything that's been said. It's been really complicated, but for me, right at the end, that one exercise of marching in place and pointing to the opposite knee, that just, I guess that was the cue, and kind of put it all together, for at least for now. Thank you for that.
Yeah, so, and especially when you find one of the cues or one of the exercises really like has that fitting feeling, that's the one to play with when you're out for a walk, or finding yourself freezing, or just sticking in your walk, is play with that. Alrighty, I think we will leave it there for today. And what I'm planning for next week is a focus on feet and legs. So making it easier to lift your feet, making it easier for your feet to support your hips. Because when we're sitting, we've done a lot of work with how our sit bones support us and getting more even in our sitting. But there's some fine stuff to play with the feet. So that'll be next week.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everybody for coming. Have a good weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The person in the class as iPhone, if you have a chance to either put in the chat your name or to share that with Mira or I, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. See you next week.
See you next week.
Thank you.
Bye.
Marcia. Thank you, Marcia.